Hello, welcome to AT&T ThreatTraq for November 8th, 2012. This program provides network security highlights, discussion, and countermeasures for cyber threats. Today, I am Brian Rexroad. Today, joining us, we have Jim Clausing, Dave Gross, and John Markley. And thanks for joining us, guys. We have several things to cover today. Let's go ahead and start with the Kindsight Security Labs malware report. This is a quarterly report they come out with. And Dave, what did you find in that report?
Thanks, Brian. What I found in that report, first of all, let me give you a little background about Kindsight. They provide security and analytics platforms for service providers. And the service providers embed these devices in their networks to analyze the traffic and help to protect their customers. And so the data is derived from that information. So I wanted to, give a context of where this comes from. So what they found was that 1 in 7, or about 13% of the home networks, are infected with malware. And they break that down even more. Almost half of it is with high-level threats, with botnets, with rootkits, and with banking trojans. And just about the other half is moderate threats, spyware, browser hijacks, adware, that type of thing. So it's kind of interesting to look at this thing and think about, 13% to me sounds low. I had expected it to be a lot higher. Anyway, they broke it down even more in terms of the most common botnet that they had found was ZeroAccess. That one has, they estimate, 2 million infected machines worldwide, about 685,000 in the U.S. That's a peer-to-peer. It's a peer-to-peer network where it uses peer-to-peer for command and control. It does click fraud, and it also does Bitcoin mining. And for those that aren't aware, Bitcoining is a virtual currency that was created on the Internet, and basically you can mine Bitcoins by doing some very intense calculations and eventually getting rewards by getting some Bitcoins, which are actual, there's actual value to them. I think the conversion rate is about $10 per Bitcoin or something like that. So anyhow, they're also using these machines for running those calculations for the Bitcoin mining.
Using it as a supercomputer, is that a correct interpretation?
Yeah, that's what it looks like. It looks like they're using it as a supercomputer to, spin out all these calculations and then get back the results and, harvest the Bitcoins from it.
It would be an interesting study. Perhaps somebody's done this, but, how many MIPS or, teraflops or whatever the measurement is today can you get out of 1 million infected PCs on average?
Yeah.
I suspect that
is the malware definition here the same? Like, is it spyware and adware, or is it just viruses and trojans?
Well, in this case, I think it's just doing the Bitcoin mining and the click fraud. So it's not really spyware for the ZeroAccess, as far as I know. The next one, the next most common one, though, is the TDSS Solarian family, sometimes known as TDL4. Now, that one is a really malicious one. That has rootkit. It infects the master boot record on the machine, hides from antivirus and other security software. And a lot of times that comes just as a downloader, but then it allows the botnet operators to download more type things like spam, banking trojans, where, I think that's where you were getting, John, is the banking trojan, and also some identity theft, keyboard sniffing and stuff like that.
Well, and the DNS changer was a payload associated with TDSS and Solarian for a while as well.
Right, before that takedown. I think the DNS changer was actually in their report last quarter, but I think it dropped down low enough that it was. They said that there was still some residual activity for DNS changer, but they have stopped reporting it in the quarterly reports. The main infection method, they said, is by either visiting malicious website, running exploit kits like Black Hole, things like that, the drive-by type of attacks. The users are sent there usually by spam emails with, some sort of enticing message in there and then a URL link to take them to the site. Although sometimes the spam comes with the malicious payload, so they're attributing most of these infections to that type of method.
Right. And, it's been a little while since John Hogaboom has done one of the malware spam reports, but we certainly had seen a number of examples of that sort of thing in those reports where they were using black hole exploit and such that were, obviously showing up in this discussion as well. Right,
absolutely. And then the final part of the report had to do with mobile malware, and there they said that 0.3% of the devices were infected with malware, and they felt that was low because the total device count that they were using includes many phones that aren't malware targets. A lot of them, don't have a lot of the apps that get loaded on and stuff like that. But of those, they were the ones that they saw in majority were either tethered laptops or Android phones and or Android devices, I should say, and basically they would either steal information about the device, send SMS messages, or be adware. And some of the adware is getting kind of aggressive where they'll use push notification or home screen icons and stuff like that so that it shows up even when the app is not being used. So, people get frustrated with those because they don't really see an underlying cause of what's, putting the adware up there. They can't get rid of it because they don't realize it's connected to this app that they have on their phone.
I think, thanks, Dave. And we're going to talk a little more about some of the malware and vulnerabilities associated with mobility in a moment here. And I just wanted to mention we're going to revisit that ZeroAccess botnet, the one that was reported as the most active, 2 million infected users worldwide, and see how that's manifesting itself in the Internet Weather Report. But at this point, let's go ahead and pass it over to John Markley here. And, John, you had some recent sort of current events or topics in mobile security. Yep. What have you found?
Yeah, so I got 3 slides to show, but I do want to, kind of tag on to what was just said is the Android devices. I know Lookout did a study not too long ago that really kind of looked kind of nasty for Android, and I don't want to, you don't want to say that, there's a product that's more or less, better than others, but you have to be real careful. Android gives you a lot of flexibility, and you can really create some problems for yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. So, there's certainly a market there for, those that want more flexibility. It's a more open platform. They're more open, not just in terms of and I'm sort of comparing here with Apple's platform. They're more open in terms of the API, so there's more flexibility associated with that. And on top of that, they're more flexible in terms of the markets that you can go to for apps. And some of those markets have less scrutiny about how those apps are distributed. And this is exactly one of the the security aspects of it, or one of the attributes that are compromised in the course of doing that. Yeah. So,
I'm just going to talk about a couple things. The first one, really from a mobile perspective, is this Broadcom chipset, which was a denial of service. It's kind of a transient denial of service. It's just recently hit the news, and people really don't think about what do I got, what's a with a chipset. That's the raw guts, if you want to think about it, in the phones or the devices. And there are two recent chips that were in these, this latest attack vector, which was a denial of service attack that it's kind of a funny one just because it's what they call transient. So if you move from tower to tower, or you migrate from a different room or turn it off, sometimes it'll just go away. So it's kind of a hard attack to actually see somebody malicious using, and there really hasn't been anything live in the world on it. But
so John, you're saying that somebody's got to be very close to the phone in order to have this happen?
They don't have to necessarily be very close, but they do have to have it really targeted. And I would venture to say, and I can't swear to this, but I believe that you have to be actually in the same, off the same tower, even to make this functional. Okay. So it's such a rare occasion, right? that somebody, if a neighbor or somebody just says, "Hey, I want," I know that Markley's got a bunch of bad, these old phones, and I'm going to target him. But as soon as I pick up and walk, or get in the car, it's over with. Mm-hmm. The best part of this overall is that most of the devices that are impacted by this are these older devices, and it's on the kind of a chart here, that tells you it's nothing new. It's not the iPhone 5. It's not the brand new Samsung devices. It's not the new ones. But the fun thing, I guess, is this Ford Edge right here. Right? It's a car. You have devices that are susceptible in your vehicles now because everybody wants to be some kind of a wireless or Wi-Fi functionality. And you gotta think that I have to patch these. So the solution here is that if you're really concerned about it, if you have one of these devices, is you'll need to get a hold of your OEM, so your original equipment manufacturer. So get a hold of, and unfortunately you have to actually contact Apple or Motorola because, there's really not much else and not many other things that can fix these.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like this is a driver patch of some sort that is, we're really talking about getting to the hardware level when we start.
It's a firmware update, and that's really it. So, it can be fixed. It doesn't require you to pry out a chip and put a new one in. But I wouldn't get excited about it, but it's just kind of interesting to think about these chipsets, especially the broadband chipsets, have been susceptible to numerous problems over the years, and here's another one. Mm-hmm. So.
All right. Okay, interesting.
The second one I was going to talk about is just recently is the Apple iOS, and if anybody's got an Apple device, especially the fourth generation iPods even, you want to load the 601 release. It fixes some pretty significant functionality issues, but also some security issues. And, most people should have gone to 6.0 if they can. If you have the older devices, you can't, obviously, but it fixes some kernel problems where, and that it fixes a passcode lock issue, which is probably one of the most significant ones, is that if you have physical access to the device, you can actually get into the passbook, which is the secret sauce there with all your information in it. And then the WebKit, if you go to a WebKit issue. Like I said, but I think most people, go ahead, I'm sorry.
I was going to say, we've talked on the program several times previously about vulnerabilities associated with WebKit. In fact, we've probably reported on this specific vulnerability perhaps numerous times in the past, and that we had also talked about the lag time of actually getting those patches into devices, and here's perhaps one of those examples.
And WebKit is certainly one that I suspect in the last 6 months I've probably seen a patch a month come out for somebody on WebKit from some vendor somewhere. So it certainly gets patched a lot. Right. Functionality, that's kind of probably the most people would worry about with 601. With the iPhone 5, you had the problem that people couldn't get wireless syncing and software updates over the air. There were some reliability issues with Wi-Fi. Probably the biggest issue is the very last item here, which is that fixes a bug affecting Exchange meetings. And that was the problem where if you were a recipient on your phone and say cancel or deny an Outlook or an Exchange meeting invite, when you hit the deny, it sent it to everybody on the distribution and canceled the meeting for everyone.
Oh, That's painful.
Not a nice bug. So they have fixed that. They have not fixed the functionality like maps and some of the things that people complain about with Apple, but it gets some good things, and I do definitely recommend it from both security and a functional perspective.
Well, less meetings would be better to improve productivity.
Yeah.
That's a possibility. Something that came to mind here looking at this is a 6.0.1, and I think the conventional wisdom is that, why not just wait until 6.1 comes out? That 6.0.1 isn't a significant patch. And, we've talked a number of times about how important it is to keep mobile devices up to date. But when patches like this come out, I think perhaps their numbering scheme here is that 6.1 would have some, new features associated with it, where the 0.1 is probably primarily bug fixes. These aren't insignificant here, at least from a security standpoint, that, we should be paying attention to all of the patches. In fact, perhaps the patches are more important from a security standpoint than the feature releases.
Yeah, I know a number of people who will skip the .0 release and wait for the .0.1 just because they figure that first big one may have stability issues or something that managed to slip through in the testing, and so they'll always wait for the .0.1.
Mm-hmm. Yep, makes sense.
And then my last little bugaboo here is this Adobe Flash, and I hate to always harp on it, but if you're running any kind of Adobe product, it's been a target. It's been just certainly an attack vector for some time, and you want to keep up on the latest versions. And though I'm kind of talking mobile here, I did want to highlight that there are Windows, Mac, and Linux updates too. So they just came out with this. I had to just go through and update all these numbers just the other day, this week, because they updated this again just this week, and so you want to be on these versions. Flash is kind of going out of the Android market, so they're trying to get rid of it. But Air is certainly going to be around for some time, and which is a tool for some web development and that type of effort. And so even if you're on a mobile device, still keep updating as much as they'll let you update, but certainly start concentrating on this Air product if you have that, because it looks like a vector that's coming up.
Yeah, you mentioned that Adobe isn't the only target. Obviously, any application that has vulnerability associated with it is going to be targeted. It just happens to be Adobe has a couple of sort of key things that are somewhat pervasive. They're freely available. That's the Adobe Flash Player, this Air thing, and there's also the PDF reader. And, they've both been very common formats for providing media. There's web media through the Flash Player, documents through PDF format, so that it gives you a little bit of portability across platforms. And as a consequence, it appears that because they're so pervasive, they've also been targeted in terms of zero-day vulnerabilities or zero-day attacks, and a means to, get access privileges onto platforms infect those machines. So,
I'd venture to say if you did a study on on at least email-borne virus or malicious attachments, the Adobe products would be number one easily. And Flash and Air are not exempt from that.
Right, and that's because they're, as Brian said, because they're everywhere. So the bad guys get big bang for their buck that way. So.
Yeah. So good. Thank you.
Yeah, there's very interesting topics there. One's obviously to reinforce the need to keep our devices up to date, and not just in terms of the applications, but also the firmware that supports the network access. And with that, I guess, Jim, you have something to talk about that's more related to mobile apps as well, right?
Yeah. Early this week, or maybe it was the tail end of last week, with all the noise from the weather situation and the election, I didn't notice it until early this week. But a few of the news sources started commenting on how hundreds of Google Play apps were able to specify or were able to spoof SMS and MMS messages on Android devices. And so it turns out this vulnerability was actually discovered by some researchers at North Carolina State that we've had some dealings with in the past. And they discovered a vulnerability in the Android open source project, the code that is the basis for the firmware images on most Android mobile devices, that allowed running applications without any special permissions to write text messages with spoofed senders directly to the inbox of the local device. So people could fake text messages or video messages, MMS or SMS messages. The details of this aren't quite public yet, because the vendors the providers are all rushing to try to provide patches to it. Google apparently has updates that will fix this issue going forward in the base release. But it could be kind of ugly if the bad guys start using it. There's not a lot of evidence that they're using it for the smishing type attacks, the SMS phishing, to lure folks out to other websites to get infected or to steal ID, identification type stuff. But where they do see it being actually used by legitimate applications out there is for displaying ads. Some of the stuff that we had talked about just a couple minutes ago. So it's kind of a big deal, but there's not a lot we can do about it until the providers provide us updates to it. It's not something that we can just change a setting on an existing device and not be vulnerable to it.
So to some extent, it appears that this is a little bit as a matter of perception. So as you mentioned, the way it's being used today is in the context of adware, which is a legitimate way for app providers to get monetary gain from the apps that they're distributing to users. Users seem to love free apps as much as they love free television, and it's, we all know that it's free because it's sponsored. And so in that context, it sort of makes sense. Now, to use this in a malicious sense, they'd still need to get it through the App Store, or you'd have to get it through some alternative store that isn't controlling it. Am I interpreting that correctly?
Well, sort of. Yeah, the code that would allow the app to fake a text message that could be used for nefarious purposes is in about 200 legitimate apps right now. The way they happen to be using it is for ads. But essentially, as the professor here at North Carolina State points out, and I know the text is too small on this to read, but this is just a screenshot of the website where he announced it. But the key point here is that essentially the right SMS capability is getting leaked. So apps that don't ask for this capability can actually, by playing some tricks, use it anyway.
Okay.
And so they have to purposefully try to use this vulnerability. They don't just, it's not something somebody can go out and accidentally stumble across or it actually has to be coded into the app.
Yes.
Right. Okay.
Okay.
And there's no way for the user to look at a text message, and there's no way to drill down into the headers and stuff like that, like you would an email message, to try to figure out or look for some clue that maybe it was locally generated.
That's true, but apparently the capability is such that it can fake it out so that it looks like it came, from elsewhere. It's got the ability to do generate it internally, and write it to the inbox, but without looking like it came external.
That's probably as important as anything else. That is the fact that they can fake where it appears to have come from could be misleading, whether or not it's used even for malicious purposes or not.
Right.
Okay, so very good. Thanks, Jim. That's, as we've I hopefully made a very clear point in the course of the program so far here, is that, keeping on top of the vulnerabilities associated with mobility applications and keeping those patched is going to be important as we go forward. Let's take a look at the internet weather for the last week or so here. And at the top of the list, basically, this is not a particularly new set of activity, but it certainly is one that's persisting as we speak. And we've seen a growing trend, although the graph here doesn't really reflect that growing trend, but we certainly have seen a growing trend in terms of frequency of what I'll call SNMP reflection attacks. And this is activity, basically what we're showing here or looking at is source port 161 UDP activity. This is, for the most part, flooding activities or denial of service attacks that are using available SNMP responders that are accessible on the Internet, sending a small query to those, but using a spoofed source address, and then causing the return traffic, the response traffic from those SNMP servers to send an amplified response and consequently flooding a target of attack that was that spoofed source address. We're seeing increased byte activity as the anomaly here. Now, most of the activity or the largest sets of activities were actually back around the third week in October, around that time period. But we're certainly seeing persistence in activity. And what we're showing here, by the way, is in terms of bits per second. And, these are peaking out around 140 megabits per second. That is certainly not the largest of this sort of attack that's known. I have peers in the industry that have indicated that they've seen 60 gigabit attacks using this sort of method. But these attacks, as I said, are basically indicating anomalies along those lines. Most of the recent targets we've seen have been actually targets in France, which is some part of the reason that this activity is probably showing a little bit small. And we're seeing an occasional target in the United States associated with this as well. Usually short attacks, but certainly ones that we want to be paying attention to. And there is some advice from the BitTag. This is a broadband internet technical working group that provides guidance for broadband service providers to protect against this and other sorts of activities like this. Another set of activity we're seeing here, this is increase in sources scanning on port 23 TCP, that's Telnet. And this appears to be associated with a activity that we've been reporting on for some time now. It's that security surveillance camera DVR botnet. Now, one of the things that's significant about this is certainly that botnet had been somewhat quiet for a while. We've still seen that command and control has been present, it's been active, but it hasn't been doing heavy reconnaissance as we've seen previously. This is a little bit of a resurgence here, and an increase up to what we see on the peaked out here is up around 18,000 sources scanning on port 23. And this is presumably to recruit new members into this botnet. Now, one of the things that we've seen that's different is certainly what I would describe as a large increase in the number of participants, relatively speaking, from India. And doing a little investigation into this, we found that those participants aren't really security surveillance camera DVRs, In this case, it appears to be some sort of a router or actually a wireless access device of some sort and a management interface associated with those. So I think the general message here is that there are lots of embedded software systems that are becoming network connected, whether they're part of a network device or simply an appliance that's installed into a home network even, or a small business network. And we also have to be paying attention to patching cycles for those and protections of those devices. And typically they don't have antivirus, so these types of events aren't currently being detected. And I thought it'd be interesting to show a little bit of a geographic distribution for this botnet in general based on the activity we've recently seen. As I'd mentioned, in that peak activity, we were seeing around 17,000 sources doing the scanning. This is just a random selection of 5,000 of those addresses that are mapped. That's basically where I top out in terms of being able to actually map them reasonably. And you can see that there is this typical concentration in the United States. Yellow indicates, by the way, that it's a heavier concentration of infected devices. Certainly you see a number in Europe as well, but it seems that there are heavier concentrations of infections in China, and as I mentioned, there was a large increase in India as well. The next set of activity we've reported on this sort of activity, I guess, perhaps looking well back into the spring. I don't recall seeing it since, but this is, again, reconnaissance activity, a little different type of reconnaissance activity. This is actually scanning on port 0 TCP, which isn't allocated to any particular application. We see 30 days of activity here, and these scans appear to be what we call Christmas tree scans. That is, they set all of the flags in the TCP packet, initialization packet, or the probe packet that's being sent, and the type of response you get back can give some insight into what type of operating system or what type of device is responding. Most of the probes that we're seeing here, at least the recent ones, are from a single source in Russia. And I would say on the order of about 10 times as much as the next, and there are several sources that are doing this, but most of them from that single source in Russia. And you can see there's some persistence that had been taking place about, in early November here, so a week or two ago. Next we have, our sort of standard what's taken place, and this is based on activity from yesterday. This is the most probed ports, and, fairly typical for the most part. What we're seeing here is port 445 is sort of at the top of the list. And next few here, the 16471, 16464, and also the 16470, all of those are associated with this ZeroAccess botnet that we referred to earlier. I'll be providing a little bit of a graph associated with that in the next slide here. And then some of the other ports that we're seeing, fairly typical, again, password guessing attacks on 1433 TCP, that's associated with Microsoft SQL database. 3389 TCP, that's remote desktop protocol. Port 23, that's Telnet. Port 22, SSH. And this port 123 UDP is not security related. That's network time protocol, and sometimes the responses actually have a source and destination port 123, so it shows up in this data. It appears like reconnaissance, but it's not. And then, as I mentioned, let's take a quick look at the ZeroAccess botnet. And this is the peer-to-peer activity associated with that botnet, the command and control associated with it. And in fact, I think it's really sort of a malware update or, a software update interface. But it does give some indication of the size of the botnet in a relative sense in terms of, or the scale of that botnet. And what we're looking at is actually the last 365 days of activity here. And we're doing it in terms of the number of packets. So it doesn't really give you a count of how many participants there are, but it certainly gives you a relative measurement. And as you can see back here, it was about the third week in April is where we started to really pick up growth in this botnet. It seems to have sort of peaked out up around, this was out the middle of summer here, that around the beginning of August was sort of the peak point. and it has declined a little bit in strength since then, but only perhaps maybe 25 or 30% at the most in terms of it decreasing in the amount of activity, which presumably indicates a decrease in the number of infected hosts. Hopefully this is an indicator that the antivirus companies have picked up on some of the signatures associated with this malware and have been able to eradicate some of it, but there's certainly a largest number of infections out there. And as has been reported earlier, the ZeroAccess botnet is predominantly doing click fraud and Bitcoin mining, so a user that's infected with it isn't necessarily losing directly through virtue of that infection, other than computer cycles are being stolen from them. So perhaps there's a little less motivation on the user's part to really do something about this. So certainly any sort of malware of this sort would have the potential to do something bad to its host as well.
Brian, quick question. That little dip there.
This one right here?
Yep, that one right there. That, do we think because some of the infected machines were affected by Sandy, or is that a...
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. It could be a consequence of Sandy. To my knowledge, we did not have any hits in our analysis platform that gathers this information. So I suspect that may have been an impact of Sandy. Whether it's the end users or their internet connectivity, yeah. So perhaps this is an indication of how many infected users there are in the New Jersey, New York area. It's scary to think it's that many.
Right. But you can see how noisy this botnet is. I mean, this is just command and control. This isn't the click fraud that you're talking about. This is actually just the communication within the botnet.
That's correct, Dave. Good point. And last but not least, our standard in terms of pie graph in terms of the most sources that are doing the probing. As usual, port 445 is pretty much at the top here, but I didn't do the exact measurement to see. Actually, port 23 is approaching, if not exceeding, the top rank port here in this case. That's relatively unusual. And that would be related to what we had pointed out earlier in the discussion of that, the security surveillance camera DVR botnet that is doing probing on port 23, presumably to do password guessing attacks, looking for open telnet access to infect additional machines. And then similarly, we are seeing port 210 TCP activity. That's the peer-to-peer activity associated with that DVR botnet. And we've already talked about port 3389, that's a remote desktop protocol that's being probed. And then additionally, we have port 5900 TCP showing up on this graph. Certainly not anywhere near as significant in terms of the number of sources that are doing that probing, but this is virtual network computing, which is similar to RDP. Basically a different product brand. And we did also see probing activity associated with this, that is recent alerts associated with 5901 and 5902 TCP. Those are alternative ports for that same application, that's virtual network computing. With that, I'd like to thank you for joining us today. That's the show. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you certainly can email us at threattrack@list.att.com. The video program is available from the AT&T Tech channel at att.com/threattrack. It's also available on YouTube. And the audio versions are available from FeedBurner as well as iTunes. Just search for ThreatTraq. And thank you, Jim, John, and Dave for joining today. Thank you, audience, for joining today as well. I'm Brian Rexroad. We'll be back next week for another AT&T Threat Track. And until then, keep your network safe.